Welcome back, casual gardeners. 2024 is actually the very first year that home gardeners can choose to grow GMOs in the garden. We've got the firefly petunia, which is a flower with the genes from a species of mushroom added to it so that it can actually glow in the dark like a firefly. And we've also got the Norfolk purple tomato from Norfolk Healthy Produce. They've added anthocyanin from snapdragons to these. So anthocyanin is naturally occurring in tomatoes. There's just so much in these that it's also in the flesh and the juice of the tomato, not just in the peel. I'm joined today by Dr. Ryan Jackson from Utah State University. Dr. Jackson and USU have put together a much more comprehensive video about the subject of genetic engineering and genetic modification, and you can find that video linked in the description of this video if you'd like to learn more. So stay tuned if you think you'd like to see me eat one of these genetically modified tomatoes.
So I think it's wise to not have just the word GMO means I need to be afraid of it. Mm-hmm. But what we really need to do is understand, okay, why is this considered a GMO? What has gone into it? Is that harmful? Is it not harmful? I think like any other technology, technologies have risk, and understanding the risk is what we need to do.
We've been changing DNA since centuries before we even knew what DNA was. But some methods of changing DNA are not considered GMO, and some methods of changing DNA are. You'll probably be surprised by some of the distinctions that are made. We can all agree that selective breeding shouldn't need a label. We've been doing it for thousands of years. With selective breeding, breeders wait for a trait to randomly appear in their livestock via a mutation. They call these sports. And then they do their best to fix that trait from the sport into a population. Random mutations happen all the time. The average human being is born between 200 and 300 new mutations that they can pass down to our offspring. But even with all these mutation events going on, breeders have to wait, sometimes for a long time, for a useful sport that they can do selective breeding on. An example of selective breeding in our gardens would be heirloom tomatoes. Hybridization is a way that breeders can maybe speed up the process a little bit and possibly have a little bit more control over the results of their breeding. When we cross two closely related species or cultivars, what we hope is that we're going to get offspring that have mostly positive traits from the two parent organisms and preferably not a lot of the negative traits. We can do hybridization in animals and plants, but when we do hybridization in animals, we're a lot more likely to get reproductive issues like we do with a mule. Many of us may choose to grow hybrid tomatoes in our gardens because we'll get better vigor or better disease resistance or maybe earlier fruit. With hybridization, we still don't have a ton of control and our tool set is pretty limited. Back in the 1930s to 1940s, breeders realized that if we expose mostly plants, to radioactive sources, we can get them to mutate faster, and we don't have to wait for random mutations to just naturally occur. These days, chemical mutagens are a lot more popular because they're a lot easier to control in a lab environment, and you're less likely to make yourself sick from them, but they're both pretty dangerous. When we do mutagenesis on an organism, this is an uncontrolled mutation or set of mutations, and they will often go to market without a full understanding of what has mutated and what new proteins they're producing. But because these mutations are not directed, it is considered a natural process, and nobody in the federal or state regulations and nobody in the non-GMO project is trying to get us to regulate mutagenic organisms. So mutagenesis is fascinating, actually. That's not being considered genetic modification.
Right.
Which kind of blows my mind because mutagenesis is so sloppy.
Yeah.
It seems so crazy to not be worried about that, to have over 3,000 mutagenic products or progeny on the market.
Yeah.
Yeah, nobody knows when you're eating a ruby red grapefruit, you're basically eating the Godzilla of grapefruits.
Yeah.
Yes.
The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles of grapefruit fruits. Yeah, so back to education, like no one's really that afraid of the ruby red grapefruit, but it was modified by a technology to get us those traits.
None of what we've talked about so far is a GMO, and nobody wants to call it a GMO, which, in the case of mutagenic organisms, is pretty crazy. But now we're moving on to the types of changes that at least one organization wants to label as a GMO, no matter what. These methods are explained way better in Dr. Jackson's video, so I want to emphasize again that I've got that linked down in the description of this video. If you want to learn more about how we do GMO and GE crops, that is the place for you to go. While I was watching the video that you linked me to, I got a feeling, but it wasn't made really explicit, that there is maybe a difference between GMO and GE.
Yes, I think there is. There's basically two different types of technologies that I know of where we're modifying the genes of an organism. The GMO technology kind of began in the late 90s, maybe even early 90s. It was something where there's a bacteria that infects a plant. And as it does that, it actually, if you throw in a new gene with it, this bacterium can basically insert that gene wherever it just kind of more random than anything. And so in this case, what a lot of people think of when they think of GMOs is they're taking some gene that might protect the plant or give an added effect to that plant, and they're just doing this kind of experiment where they're throwing everything together and they're crossing their fingers that the new gene gets inserted. And I think that's what I would call a GMO. That DNA has been modified, and generally, I think another caveat to call it a GMO is usually that gene is something that would never normally end up in that plant, maybe from a completely different organism. A gene edit would be very precise. The scientists or the agriculturists, they know where in the DNA they want this edit to happen. So they might be tweaking just a couple pieces of DNA to increase the production of a vitamin, for instance, or increase the production of a color. That would be a type of gene edit. I would be far less skeptical of a gene edit because that's something that could probably happen naturally. That could happen with, the sunlight hitting the gene, and it just changes because of UV light mutation or something like that.
So with gene edit, we're upregulating, downregulating, or knocking out.
Knocking out, yep, exactly. The other thing that I know of, and this is approved by the USDA, if I can take two species that I normally could cross, but I'm just kind of crossing my fingers is that I cross these plants that the traits I want end up in the progeny. If I instead say I want that gene from this type of wheat to go into this type of wheat or something, but I do that with gene editing technology, that is also considered a gene edit. So, what I'm saying here is we're moving one gene into another plant, like a entire gene, but that's something that we could have got that same result with a crossbreeding or something. We're just more precise.
So it's like targeted hybridization.
Exactly. That's a really good way to phrase it.
The more precise gene editing technology that Dr. Jackson is talking about goes by the acronym CRISPR.
I'll just say it. It's clusters of regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats.
And the story of how scientists discovered CRISPR in the wild and learned how to use it to make precise genetic changes is absolutely amazing. Again, Dr. Jackson's video goes into more detail about that. CRISPR has often been referred to as a molecular scalpel because of the tight precision that we have when we make cuts to DNA or when we insert new strands of DNA into an organism using the technology. And it's not just for safer, more precise gene edits in food. CRISPR has already been used in experiments to treat sickle cell anemia in a human volunteer, and the procedure was successful. So CRISPR opens up a big area of gene therapies that can treat previously untreatable diseases.
In particular, the trait that's associated with gene editing is CRISPR technology. And I would just say the precursors to this technology were more sloppy. This one is far more precise. And so it seems silly to be more worried about higher precision. Now, someone could use that high precision to do something silly or dumb, So it's not like I would approve of anyone's idea, but yet if we're in this, the traditional paradigm of agricultural breeding programs, they're just trying to make the product, improve its nutrition, improve its shelf life, improve these kind of things. I don't think we should be as worried about higher precision. At least that's my opinion. Give me a specific scenario, I may change my opinion about a specific scenario.
So now that we have a more thorough understanding of what GMOs are or aren't, should they be allowed? If they should be labeled, how should they be labeled? If they should be regulated, how should they be regulated? I actually thought I had a strong and established opinion about labeling GMOs before I started researching this video. And my opinion was that labeling is generally harmful because it creates the impression that GMOs are generally harmful. As I've researched this topic, my opinion has flipped 180 degrees, and now I am pro-labeling. I've realized that the issue of labeling and disclosure might have been the single largest factor in getting us to where we are today with the massive public distrust of the technology. But even though I've reversed my opinion on labeling, that doesn't necessarily mean that the way GMOs are labeled right now is the right way to do it. So we've got different kinds of labeling. I've been thinking a lot about that because I know the Flavor Saver tomato, when it came out in the 90s, they self-labeled. Mm-hmm. And they had like this massive public acceptance. And then they ended up having to sell to Monsanto.
Okay.
That was like a positive case of labeling.
Uh-huh.
Right. But then on the negative side, I'm not anti-non-GMO project. Uh-huh. But it does feel a little bit not helpful.
Slapping a label at any GMO is unhealthy or is something we want to avoid seems a little simplistic. That said, I can understand both sides of the coin here. I can understand someone, and even the farmers who are frustrated with Monsanto and some of the things they've done over the years, and big agricultural companies, really not educating and sometimes not even really thinking about how their products might have long-term impacts. I'm an educator at heart, and I just really think that that's really wise for people to go into these questions with their eyes wide open. And that you might find a product that you say, now that I understand that product, I don't think it's one I'm going to plant in my garden, or I might not eat that, or I might even protest. I might even say, hey, I really don't think this engineered thing should be out there. There might be some harm. But on the other side, you might say, that's a great idea. Added nutrition to a cultivated crop that we've cultivated over eons that has human influence for hundreds and hundreds of years. Why not make that a little more healthy to folks? Why not allow it to be resistant to heat or drought or those kind of things? There's a lot out there that's really good with this technology, and maybe there's also some silly choices or unwise choices. When I think about gardening, why not, change the color of my plants? We've been doing it for years with breeding and other things. Why not tweak it with genetics? And as long as we can say, oh, that's safe for the animals in the yard and the people around, and how is that any different than changing the color of my roses through a more traditional means? Just like I don't love the idea when my dishwasher breaks or right now my dryer's broken, I don't love the idea of going and learning about how my dryer works so I can fix it. I think other people don't love the idea of learning about genetics. They prefer it to be simple and say, I'm against all GMOs because for me, that's a lot of work to just learn genetics, But there's definitely something I think worth understanding that, hey, it's not as cut and dry as bad, good. They go in two bins.
The question of what to label and how is a thorny one. This became even more clear when we were discussing gene edits that do not introduce any DNA that wouldn't normally be found in an organism. Things like deleting genes or knocking out genes or doing some of that precision hybridization. Things that nature might do on its own at random. There can be a lot of sunlight between what state and federal regulators want to label as GMO and what nonprofit or private organizations are trying to get labeled as GMOs.
The USDA has basically said, we're not going to regulate that kind of gene editing. We're not going to create financial hurdles for companies if they're making products that could be produced through traditional means?
Ooh, that could be actually a really big conflict between the federal regulatory system and the non-GMO project.
Oh, yeah.
Because when I went to their website, and of course I'm going to want to double check that for my channel. So they said anything that the genes have been modified in any way, they're considering a GMO.
Yeah.
Through human direct intervention. So I'm not going to go so far as to say all hybrids are now GMOs.
Well, that's kind of what
technically they'd have to go there logically.
Well, and they have I would say the non-GMO project has a financial interest in people continuing to use GMOs. And so if we start, changing the name, they're going to want to start changing what they call GMOs also.
It seems like this issue is portrayed a lot more simply in the media than is realistic for either side of the debate. Biochemists are generally pretty excited about gene editing. It's their profession after all. But the issue isn't should we label? The issue is how should we label? Just as you can use the same technology to make a sword or a plowshare, you can use the same gene editing technology to make a harmful or a beneficial gene edit. Labeling a box contains steel doesn't really tell me whether or not the contents of the box are a weapon. Are there any negative claims about GMOs or GE foods that you think are accurate?
I think it's okay to be concerned when, for instance, especially with GMO, let's just start there, where, for instance, a company is far more concerned about the resistance to pests than they are about, what the humans will eventually consume. And so they might put an enzyme or some kind of chemical production in a plant that is normally found in something we wouldn't eat. And I don't know all the details, but that's where I could agree with the GMO product. The people who are, is a pesticide now in the leaves of my plants? Because it seems like at least if I spray a pesticide, I could wash it off. In this case, it's now, so am I now chewing on a pesticide, and is that getting into my system? And of course, we also know that some of these chemicals, if we don't know how they'll interact with our microflora, so maybe they don't harm human cells, but what do they do to our own bacteria? I do think that there is definitely room for scrutinizing what we're changing. And do we know that this change, especially when we're bringing an enzyme or a chemical production pathway into a plant, and that's just normally not there? Also, you could think about allergies and other things. Does someone know that, I'm allergic to this chemical that's never in wheat, but now it is because of a GMO? Now I'm going to be allergic to that. There's things where if there was more transparency, that's what I would really advocate for. And I do think that labeling it, GMO means it's bad. I would rather know, what has been changed? I would hesitate if I saw certain chemicals being produced or pesticides in certain crops. I'd hesitate to eat them if I knew the biochemical pathway of that pesticide was probably going to hurt microbes in my gut or humans when they get into my system. That's where I see that the anti-GMO folks are, they've got a good point. I can also get behind getting frustrated when a company's not transparent. If they're not telling me what's happening, boy, that's really frustrating.
Yeah, I think as I've been researching this, the biggest single mistake with rolling out GM or GE technology has been that we went from fully transparent to no transparency at all. And if you want to fuel conspiracy theories and paranoia, there's nothing more efficient than clamming up.
Yeah. And that, and I see that now even on other technologies, these GE technologies, there's a lot of intellectual property. They're probably not so much as trying to hoodwink the consumer as they are to say, we don't want our competitors to understand what we're doing so we can hang on to this for financial gain. But I wish there was somewhere in the middle where they could be transparent and still own their intellectual property. To me, it seems the best thing for the public would be transparency.
As much fun as I was having, eventually I had to get down to brass tacks and ask the question most of you are probably wondering. Do you agree or disagree with Dr. Jackson's response? Let me know down in the comments. So would you eat a purple tomato?
Would I eat a purple tomato? So what is added to the purple tomato? It's a dye. It's something that makes it more purple. But is it a vitamin?
So my understanding of the highly technical paper that I read, which could be deeply flawed, is that they have upped the natural production of anthocyanin in the tomato, and they have made the production not specific to the tomato skin where it usually is, but they somehow managed to make it so it's not produced in the leaves or the stem tissue, just the skin and the flesh and the
pulp.
Juice.
I'm just going to kind of work through my thinking here. So anthocyanin, that to me sounds like it also would be healthy for me to eat. It sounds like it's a vitamin.
It is a natural antioxidant.
Okay.
In fact, I think the same people who did the engineering, they fed a diet high in purple tomatoes to some lab mice that are particularly prone to cancer. And they noticed a 30% decrease in cases of cancer in their non-control lab mice. Although I am reticent to go so far as to say that purple tomatoes will prevent cancer.
Right. That seems like maybe a claim you don't want to make. But, you know, to me and from what I'm hearing from you, and, you know, I would generally have no problem with this, you know, saying, hey, would you eat this purple tomato? I think if people are eating purple tomatoes and not having any severe side effects generally, I'm going to go ahead and try it.
So it is transgenic.
Oh, okay.
There is a transgene from snapdragons.
So the production of anthocyanin is coming from a gene from snapdragon. So to me, that would be considered more like a GMO than a gene edit. Because we're taking it from one organism that would normally not be able to cross with a tomato and putting it into a tomato.
So transgenes
could be considered.
Knock you into the GMO category.
I would put it in my definition, but yet I would still be very happy to try the tomato.
Yeah, I will bring you some. Just as a thank you for doing this.
Oh, I would love to try one, actually.
They're a lot of fun.
I think agriculture is a fun place to tinker because, you know, it just the stakes just aren't as high if you're trying to do this in animals. You know, it just seems, you know, you can try a lot of different things. You can look at your results. You can decide, hey, that's not what I want.
You're not a monster if you produce a plant that's struggling to live.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Well, here it goes. I agree with Dr. Jackson that how a GMO was modified is a lot more important than whether it was modified. I will eat this GMO tomato. I'm comfortable saying that because I would eat a regular tomato and I would eat a snapdragon. Snapdragons are edible. You can put snapdragon flowers on your food and it's pretty. So this little guy is just a cross between two things I would already eat. Yeah, that one was a lot better than my last one. One issue I do have with these is that their skins are so dark. And it's kind of hard to see if they've actually ripened because they turn really purple really fast. That one was nice. If you're still watching right now, take a moment to subscribe to my channel. You must have liked this video because you're still watching it. And if you didn't like it, you just wasted a lot of minutes. There's a lot more interview than what I was able to include in this video. If you'd like to see the entire interview, you'll need to be a channel member at the Unbeatable Bestie level or higher. There's not a higher level, you'll be fine. So if you are interested in that, go ahead and click the join button down below to become a member of my channel. There's over an hour of Dr. Jackson explaining this whole topic with really awesome graphics and a couple of fun jokes at the link that I've provided in the description of the video. This is a really complex topic with a lot of room for disagreement. If you guys get in arguments about this in the comments, well, that's not going to surprise me. But I do want to keep the mood cordial if you do that. We can disagree about GMOs without, you know, being disagreeable. As always, thank you for joining me in my garden, and I hope you have a wonderful time in your own.